thank you everyone for joining us today for our presentation on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am an immigration attorney with Scott Legal PC here in New York City. We're going to spend some time today talking about the TN visa. It's one of the most common visas that our law firm assists our clients with. Specifically, we'll discuss the TN visa requirements and specifically this question of whether the TN visa requires sponsorship by the employer, which is a very common question for the employer to raise. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know that Ian Scott, the founder of our firm, was actually on a TN visa for a decade, and he went through a number of renewals. So his experience navigating the process really does inform the way that we work with our clients. We really do have a client-centered approach to the way we do our work. Our firm is a full-service immigration firm. We handle not only business immigration and investment visas, but also family-based visas. So whatever immigration issues you may need assistance with, please don't hesitate to reach out to us for assistance. This webinar is part of an ongoing series. We try to hold at least 2 webinars a month, and we cover a range of immigration topics. We will be adding additional topics regularly. After the webinar, we'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen. We'll send you a comprehensive TN visa guide, a link where you can sign up for future webinars. And finally, we'll send you a link to where you can find this recording. We do record the presentation, and we actually post all of our recordings as well as shorter videos on our YouTube channel. So please do check that out if you're curious. We try to post a lot of good free information on our YouTube channel as well as our blog. So please do check those out. If you have a question, you can send it to me either through the Q&A function on Zoom or through the chat box. So please don't hesitate to do that. I will save time at the end to get through any questions that come in. All right, without further delay, let's get started by talking a bit about the TN visa requirements. To qualify for a TN visa, there are a number of requirements. The TN visa is a treaty visa, so it is rooted in NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. I'm sorry, I said a treaty visa. I meant NAFTA. So you do have to be a national of either Mexico or Canada to be eligible for a TN visa. The profession that you are coming to the US to practice must appear on a list of professions that is provided in the TN regulations. You must have the required qualifications to practice that profession, and this includes education or experience. And you must have an actual prearranged job, an actual job offer for a defined length of time with a specific employer in the United States. And finally, in that job, you must be employed to actually perform the job duties that are consistent with the listed profession. So let's get into what these items actually mean. If you Google NAFTA TN regulations, you will find a link that actually goes to the regulations, and you'll see that the regulations list a number of professions. So they start with accountant, they go through psychologists, scientists, teachers. There are really dozens of professions that are on the list of accepted professions for a TN visa. So the first step you'd want to do is, if you're considering a TN visa, you'd want to make sure that the role that you have a job offer in actually appears on the list in the TN regulations. And once you've found your profession, you'll see that the qualifications are very clearly listed after that, the name of that profession. So if we take, for example, economist, you see after economist, baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. So you need a degree in order to come to the US to work as an economist. You don't need any specific experience for that role, for the economist role. The only requirement in terms of education and work experience is baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. If we, in contrast, look at management consultant on the list, you see that they will accept a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience established by at least 5 years of experience as a management consultant, or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty. So management consultant is a unique category where the government will accept work experience in place of a degree. But for each profession that you're looking at, there are unique educational or experience requirements. So you want to make sure that you satisfy those. And we'll get into that a bit more through this presentation, what it actually means walking through that. So what is sponsorship? Again, this is one of the most common questions that we receive, especially from employers, because many employers in the United States are familiar with the requirements that apply if an employer wants to hire an H-1B worker, or for example, an L worker, an L visa worker. For an H-1B, for example, there are a number of requirements. First of all, the employer needs to make sure that they're paying at least the prevailing wage. So they have a clear wage requirement that's oftentimes above minimum wage. They also are responsible, for example, if they terminate the employee, paying for the employee's transportation back home. This is for the H-1B. They also need to notify the government if an employee is terminated. The TN visa, finally, they can't require the employee to pay for the application fees on the visa. The TN visa is completely different. And for that reason, we would say that the TN visa actually does not require sponsorship by the employer, certainly as it would apply to an H-1B visa. So for a TN visa, the employer's requirements are fairly minimal. There is no additional wage requirement in addition to minimum wage. So of course, any employer in the United States that has a certain number of employees would need to pay minimum wage, whether federal, state, whatever is the lowest wage. They'd have to do that, but there's no additional prevailing wage or no additional wage, increased wage that's based on the fact that the employee is on a TN visa. The employer does not have to pay for transportation back to the home country if the person's terminated. There's, as you see on your screen, TN visas are not location specific. So really the requirements on the employer are limited to providing a job offer letter. So the applicant, the employee, will need to provide to the government a letter in which the employer states what the role is that the person will be hired for, what the person will be paid, the period of time that they're expected to fulfill the role, whether that's a year to 3 years, and really what the job duties are. So the employer does need to provide that letter. Many employers will ask, so if I'm providing a letter that says that I'll pay this worker, $80,000 a year, but it turns out we pay them $75,000 a year, will I be liable for that? And the answer that we would typically give is that the employer letter is not necessarily intended to be a binding contract. The point of the employer letter is to lay out for the government what the job role, the job duties, and what the role is really expected to entail. But again, there is no additional wage rate, pay rate that is required as part of the TN visa above and beyond minimum wage. If the applicant, and we'll get into this a little bit more, if the applicant is applying through USCIS domestically, then the employer would be the one to complete and sign the Form I-129 to apply for status for that worker. But again, really, the obligations that come from that are really limited to the employer being honest in the answers. And again, there's no additional obligations or responsibilities that come from that, as there would be, say, for an H-1B visa. We'll get into the next 2 points that you see on your screen: filing for a TN at a port of entry or at a consulate, and filing within the United States. We'll get into those more, starting with this next slide. So Canadians and Mexicans, again, to apply for a TN visa, you either need to be a national of Canada or Mexico. And the process is different for the applicant, depending on whether they are a Mexican national or a Canadian national. Canadians really do have a streamlined application process. They can apply for a TN visa at the port of entry. They do not need to go to a consulate in Canada beforehand. They really can take their application materials to a land border or to an airport, if they're entering by air, and present it to the immigration officer, the border officer there, and say, I'm coming in to apply for a TN visa. Here's my employer letter. Here's my supporting documents. And the border officer would grant them a TN visa, TN status at that point in time. Typically, they are granted the visa for 3 years. Now, one note, spouses are eligible for TD visas, TN dependent visas. If the spouse is also a national of Canada, it's fine for them to apply at the border. However, if they are a national of another country and not a national of Canada, they would need to apply for the TD visa at a consulate. But that really is the exception. Otherwise, for Canadians, they can apply for a TN visa or a TD visa at a border. Mexicans do have a couple more steps to take. They must apply for a TN visa at a US consulate. They cannot simply show up at a border crossing or at an airport and apply for the visa there. Visa stamps are typically issued in increments of 1 year. However, if the employer letter specifies 3 years, the person can be given 3 years in TN status when they enter the US. So they would want to make clear once they have their visa, when they're actually entering the US and they're talking with the border officer, they'd want to say, sir, ma'am, as you can see from the letter, I am planning to work for this company for 3 years. Would you grant me status for 3 years? And oftentimes border officers are willing to do that. And a recent update actually from June is that Mexican nationals can now be issued TN visas for up to 4 years. So that really is a positive change for those applying who are citizens of Mexico. In certain cases, if a Mexican national is applying for a renewal of their TN visa, if they're in good standing and there's really no big material changes to their situation, oftentimes the consulate will allow them to renew their visa through mail without actually having to go in person to the consulate. But the way you would do that is to submit the materials to the consulate, and then they would invite you to actually renew by mail. So we're going to talk now about two TN categories, professions, that are particularly challenging. And I like to get into these because it really does allow us to look at how to walk through a TN visa application. So the first is management consultant. So as I mentioned briefly before, the management consultant category is unique because of all of the professions listed in the TN regulations, management consultants actually, it's one of, I believe, 2 professions that does not require a college degree. So if you don't have a college degree, you can imagine that many people are trying to fit into this management consulting category. It really is kind of one of the very few options for those who don't have a degree. So as a result, the government really does scrutinize management consultant applicants. So what are the requirements? If we pull up the regs, the requirements are either a bachelor's degree, baccalaureate, or a licenciatura degree. That is one option, or professional experience. And the professional experience can be either 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So there's kind of a spectrum. If you are if you actually are a management consultant and you say are working at a management consulting firm, a firm like Bain, BCG, McKinsey, these of course are the 3 best known, but there are many consulting firms. The easiest management consultant application is one in which the Canadian or Mexican national is coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. And really in those applications, this category is not much different from any other profession. You would provide either your educational background or your experience of 5 years working as a management consultant. And typically those applications, like I said, are straightforward. Now, where these applications get a bit more complex and certainly riskier, although we have had many approvals in these circumstances that I'm about to describe, is if the person is not coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm, but is coming to work for another company. And this person is coming to the US really to advise the company as a management consultant. So an example I like to use is, let's say there is a Canadian national who has 5 years of experience in marketing solar technology, solar panels, things like that. And this person has a job offer from a company in the US that wants to improve its operations selling solar panels. The applicant, the person, has never been a management consultant. Their expertise is regarding solar panels and marketing solar panels. So how would this work? Well, if that person doesn't fit into any other category among the TN regulations, and there's a good chance they would not, then basically the US employer would consider the option to bring them to the US as a management consultant. So that application would look as follows. If the person has a degree, and it's related to business operations, then that could satisfy the education requirement. If they don't have a degree, then what they would need to do is basically they need to rely on this opportunity to show 5 years of experience in the field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So the consulting agreement, continuing with our example, would be the employer saying, we specifically have a need for someone to come to the US and advise us on our operations and our marketing of solar panels. And so the applicant would really want to show that their experience is specific to that. Now, this is, like I said, this is possible to do, and you can do this within the management consultant category. However, there are a few things to be very mindful of. First of all, is that when someone is coming to the US to work as a management consultant, but not at a management consulting firm, such as the solar panel company I mentioned before, it is important that they are not coming to fill a permanent role. So what the government is very sensitive to is that the person who's coming in is coming to address a very specific and temporary problem. So the company, first of all, needs to say, look, our problem is that we're having a really hard time breaking into the solar panel market in a certain geography. And we really need someone to come here for a year and really share their expertise in this area to help us overcome this problem. That is in contrast to a company saying, we have a permanent role for someone who advises us on our solar panel marketing and operations, and we want someone to come here to fill that permanent role. That is probably going to be denied, versus the company saying, here's our very specific problem. It is temporary, it is discrete, and we need someone to come in and specifically address that problem. That it has a much higher chance of being approved. And you see on this third bullet, the term that's used for what I'm describing, it's called a supernumerary role. Supernumerary role really just means a role that is not a permanent one, a role that is temporary, coming in to address a specific issue. A few things, if you put all this together, what does the management consultant application need to look like? It's important that the company very specifically define the problem that needs to be addressed, that the applicant has the background and the expertise, at least 5 years, if they don't satisfy the education requirement, to actually address that specific problem. And you'd want to frame the job duties and everything around that. You would want to include other evidence to show that the role is temporary and discrete, such as a consulting agreement, that this is someone coming in to address a specific problem. But that's the management consulting role. It does have a much higher chance of denial, and for that reason, we do recommend that you work with an attorney on those applications. But like I said, we do see approvals in that category quite regularly, so it is possible to overcome those hurdles. Another challenging category is the Economist category. So The reason the Economist category is complicated is that in 2017, the US government issued a policy memo that basically narrowed what the government will consider an economist to do. Before 2017, people were coming into the US to do financial analysis, to do market research, and they were coming in under the Economist category to do that. In 2017, the government basically said, no, we're not going to allow people to come in to work as financial analysts or as market researchers in this category. So how do you navigate the Economist category? Well, the first step, as you would want to do with really any category, is to look at the requirements. So the Economist category requires a baccalaureate degree or a licenciatura degree. So you cannot qualify for it based on experience alone. So if you do have that degree, and I should say at this point, when the TN regulations state a degree, it is important that the degree is in the field for which you're applying for. So for an economist, ideally you would want a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree in economics. If you do not, you do need to show on your transcript that you've taken significant coursework in a field of economics or related to economics. So if you're in that category, we would include a transcript from your college, or an advanced degree in a master's or PhD, if that's what you have, that shows that you've taken significant coursework in a field related to economics. Now, after you have determined that you satisfy that minimum requirement, education requirement for the economist role, you'd want to make sure that the role you'll be fulfilling in the US is consistent with how the government defines the role. Now, the way you do that, the government actually publishes its understanding of what specific professions do. And the name of that publication is the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH. If we Google OOH Economist, and if you're at your computer, I do encourage you to do the same, to Google OOH Economist, and you can click, it's the Department of Labor's website, actually, the Bureau of Labor Statistics that publishes this, and you'll see a tab at the top of the screen that says what they do. So when you click that link, you see duties. Economists typically do the following: research economic issues, conduct surveys and collect data, analyze data using mathematical models, statistics. They generally have expertise in microeconomics or macroeconomics, and it really gets into detail. I'm not going to read the whole page, but it gets into detail about what the government thinks an economist does. So you would want to make sure that what you're doing as an economist in the US for the TN visa is really aligned with what the government says an economist does. And as you look through here, you'll notice that financial analysis, market analysis, is not included, but there are aspects of that may be somewhat related. So, it is important to not necessarily verbatim copy and paste these job duties that are on the OOH website to your employer letter. I wouldn't recommend that. But what I would recommend is working with your employer to really focus on these job duties and say, is there a way for my role at this US company to really be aligned so that when the government looks at my employer letter, they say, yes, this is exactly what we would expect an economist to do. So that is absolutely critical. And I should add, I didn't mention the OOH when I was talking about management consultant, but the OOH, the job duties, are also important for management consultant and in any profession. When you are defining the roles, the job duties that you'll be performing in the US, you really do want to make sure that they're aligned with how the government defines that specific that specific profession. So you can do that by going to the OOH website and seeing how the government defines the role, and then working with your employer or prospective employer to make sure that your job in the US is aligned with that. So the government, again, so that the government says, this is what we recognize an economist to do. That makes sense. So The TN application process, we already got into some details here, so I'll quickly skim through this. Canadians can apply at a port of entry. The evidence they would provide are a job offer letter. It does need to be have an original signature. That is critical. It also needs to have the employer's contact information in the letterhead at the top of the page. Some border officers are very particular about that for some reason. So you also do need documentation that proves your citizenship, a passport, for example. You also need your educational and professional qualifications. So if we're looking at the Economist category, you do need to have your original diploma. A copy is not sufficient. You need the original. You also need an original or a certified copy of your transcript if you're relying on that to show that you've completed the coursework. If you're relying on experience, such as for a management consulting role, you would need to have letters from your past positions, past experience that says from past employers, for example, that have an original signature and that say, yes, the applicant has worked for me for 5 years, and this is what they did. They do have that 5 years of experience. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster processing of TN visas. So, you can learn about these by working with an attorney, or sometimes you can find them online. I do think actually the CBP website recommends certain ports of entry for first-time TN applicants. So do check out the CBP website. And one thing we do recommend is that you call the port of entry before you actually show up, and just make sure that there are no unique procedures in place. During COVID, some ports of entry limited their hours. So you want to make sure you're there at the right time, and that they may be using a unique entrance to the building. You just want to be aware of those things. So give them a call before you show up in person. If you are a Mexican national, like I said before, you must apply at a US consulate. You would do that by filing the form DS-160. That's an online form. You'd pay the visa application fee, schedule your biometrics, your fingerprints, for example. You'd schedule your consular appointment, and then you'd attend your TN interview at the consulate. And as I said before, renewal applicants may be eligible to apply by mail, and the consulate would let you know that once you submit the application to them. If you're applying within the US, both Mexican nationals and nationals of Canada can apply within the US if they are already physically present here. They would do that by submitting a form I-129 with US Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. Again, the employer would be the one to actually sign that form. So that is a difference. If an applicant is applying at either at a port of entry or at a consulate, it would be the applicant, the prospective employee, that is submitting the application. If they are applying within the US, it is the employer that is submitting the application, and the employer would need to sign the forms. But the same supporting documents are required. If you're applying with USCIS, you don't need to send original documents. You'd only need to have them if you're applying at a consulate or a port of entry. I've touched on a number of these tips and common pitfalls throughout the presentation, but just to go back and touch on a few specifics. Again, we do recommend that you call ahead to the port of entry, particularly if you're unfamiliar with the procedures, but I would say to do it anyway. With COVID, procedures really do change frequently, so it's worth your time to just ask and make sure that you have the hours and any other requirements that you should be aware of for that port of entry. The employer who signed the letter should be available at the time that you are submitting the application. So let's say you're a Canadian national and you plan to approach the port of entry the morning of this Friday. You want to make sure that the employer that signed your employer letter is available by phone. Sometimes the border officer will call that number just to make sure that someone actually is there, that it's legitimate. Similarly, they sometimes will visit the company's website. So just make sure, if you put a link, and you should put a link to the company's website in your employer letter, make sure the link works. And if it doesn't, get in touch with the employer, let them know the link is broken and that it's going to need to work before you submit the application. Bring your original diploma official transcripts, and original signed version of the employer letter. This says, if possible, I highly recommend that you do. There are certainly a number of examples where border officers will reject the application if these originals are not provided. The TN visa is a non-immigrant visa and requires a showing of non-immigrant intent. You must be prepared to show ties to your home country, particularly if you've been in the US a long time. This is a very common question that comes up. You know, do I have to show that I own a house abroad, that I have, you know, cars abroad, whatever it is. Typically, ties to your home country, whether Mexico or Canada, are not critical unless you are renewing the visa for the third, fourth time. For initial applications, it's very rare for the officer to really care what ties you have to your home country. But it never hurts to have that evidence with you if you do own a home abroad, if you do have a bank account abroad, things like that, family abroad. It's helpful to be able to show that to the officer just in case the question comes up. But again, very unlikely for it to come up for initial applicants. So let's see, I believe that is actually our last bullet. I will turn to the question that came in, and please feel free to send in any questions if you haven't already. I do have one here. Would my wife apply for the TD visa in advance of us going to the border? That really depends on a few things. If Matthew asked this question, Matthew, if you are a national of Canada and your spouse is a national of Canada, then you would not need to go to the consulate beforehand. If you're both Canadian nationals, you can both show up at the port of entry with the application materials and get your TD and TN visas at that time. However, if your wife is not a national of Canada, she would have to get the visa at the consulate beforehand. So I see she is a national of another country. She would need to go to the consulate beforehand. Only Canadian nationals can get the TN visa or TD visa at the port of entry directly. So I don't see any other questions that have come in. I will just quickly reiterate that we will be sending an email following this presentation with a link to the PowerPoint, a link to our future webinars, as well as a link to our YouTube channel. And on our YouTube channel, we do post our webinars, past webinars, as well as shorter videos on a range of topics. So please do check that out if you get a chance. We do have an additional question. National of Mexico, member of an LLC in Massachusetts. Can my business partner offer me a job to work for my own LLC? So great question. The TN visa is not for self-employed individuals. So if you are a 50% owner in a business, there is a very good chance that you will be denied. You can have some ownership stake in the business. That does increase the risk of denial. But if you are the owner or the majority owner or the 50% owner, that is extremely risky. You can own the business that is abroad. So for example, if you are a consultant and you own a consulting firm that has a couple employees in Canada and your firm has been retained to do a job for a US company, that is okay. If the company in Canada you own, that is okay. But you cannot own the business in the United States that is hiring you as a TN worker. I would encourage you to consider an E2 visa. An E2 visa is available for nationals of Mexico, and it really is a great option for those who do own the company and want to come to the US to work for it. All right, so another question. I'm a software developer, but my degree is not in this field. Would I be able to get a TN visa? So this would go to what I mentioned before. So the first step is to go to the requirements and to see whether software engineer has an experience requirement where no degree is required. I can tell you that it does not allow that. So basically, computer systems analysts and engineers, you can apply as a software engineer under the engineer category. Both of those categories are going to require a degree, some educational background. And so basically, it's exactly what I said before. You typically need a degree in the field, so engineering or computer systems analysis, something like that. If you don't have that, it is critical that you have an original transcript that shows that you completed a significant amount of coursework in areas that are related to software development. So, that can be a hurdle, but that's the way you navigate that. Unfortunately, you cannot substitute experience when the regulations have an education requirement. All right, so I think that covers all of the questions that came in. Really do appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. Please do keep an eye out for future webinars. We hope to see you there. And in the meantime, if you do have questions about your specific circumstances, don't hesitate to reach out to schedule a consultation with us. We are always happy to talk through that. So thank you again. We look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thanks.